Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the 5th chapter in the book of James. And what I want to open with is the passage itself opens with condemnation of the worthlessness of riches. But we have to be careful in divorcing what he says from what he does not say. What he does not say is that the rich are worthless. In the opening, the 3rd chapter, he condemns prejudice of a classist nature, and the natural man, being the object of his target audience, is naturally inclined to favor the wealthy at the expense of the poor. But equality demands that we are to be equally impartial in our judgments towards the wealthy. So the wealthy are not, in some sense, they have more spiritual challenges and hurdles to overcome than we who are less wealthy do. And the important thing is that money itself is a necessary evil, but the love of money, 1 Timothy 6:10, is an unnecessary evil and is in fact identified in that passage as the root of all evil. So we want to have a balanced approach to the sin broadly condemned as prejudice of a classist nature. We want to be equally impartial to the wealthy and the poor. And with good reason, you be hard-pressed to find a prosperity gospel heretic preacher preach from this passage, because it completely dismantles the delusions that they traffic in, namely that wealth is a sign of divine favor. But we're going to open with the opening verse, and it reads, "Come now, rich ones, weep, crying aloud over the hardships coming upon you." So the rich do not have a lot to look forward to, per se, as indicated in this passage. Now, in the life in which we live, the wealth artificially insulates ones from hardships, but it also can invite hardships that one might not otherwise know in the absence of wealth. "Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten." So everything that wealth can buy is corruptible or subject to the vicissitudes of the physical realm in which it exists. So in Matthew 6 chapter, the Savior admonishes us to invest our treasures in heaven, which perish not. There is an imperishable treasure in heaven, broadly speaking, salvation, also divine fellowship, and all that entails. But when we invest our energies and our attention in our pursuit to the accumulation of worldly wealth, that is an investment misplaced, which ultimately pays for poorer dividends than that which we invest in of an eternal and incorruptible nature. "Your gold and silver have become rusty, and their rust shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasures in the last day." So he's using the analogy of the rusting or perishable nature of physical or earthly or worldly wealth, which can be used conceivably as a witness against the beholder of that wealth, the idea being nothing lasts forever on this earth, but there is such a thing as that which does last forever and is imperishable, and that is in heaven. And we are implicitly admonished only by implicit inference to cast or invest our treasures in that which perishes not. "See the wages of the workmen who mowed your field, which you kept back, cry out, and the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of Yahweh of hosts." There is scarce a cry of the destitute or inflicted or afflicted on the earth which does not escape the notice of the omnipresent Creator in heaven, who is able to hear. We read as early as Genesis 4:8 that the cries of Abel, when he was slain by Cain, cried up to him. And in the passage of Jonah, we read that the iniquity of Nineveh screeched up to the heavens and caught the attention of Yahweh, who is now hearing such demand, doesn't necessarily demand a response, an active response or a reaction, but he does at least entertain the thoughts of what is contributing to the cry which reaches in heaven. And now in this specific context, the the practice of the wealthy endemic throughout Israel's history was to withhold wages or to essentially cheat the working man out of their just due. And they were able to do this because the mechanisms and the legal systems were inherently favorable towards the wealthy who, if so inclined to be abusive, were able to act on that abusive inclination and to exploit the labor of the common man who did not have the same legal protections. But in heaven, all rights will be wrong and his justice will be swift and total. So we really want to bear that in mind before we are tempted to exploit the exploitable. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in a day of slaughter. So pleasure and luxury progressively accumulates to a fattening of one's heart, not physical fattening, but a spiritual fattening, which renders one ripe for a slaughtering, because all of this can vanish in an instant, and one day, eventually and inevitably, it will. But the fact that we persist in the benign delusion that our wealth can protect us in this passing life, it cannot protect us in the life to come. You have condemned, you have murdered the righteous. He does not resist you. In James 2:10, he speaks on the interchangeable interconnectedness of sin, the specific passage being that he who breaks the law in one area is guilty of breaking it in its entirety. So he equates the sins of covetousness and stealing to a moral equivalence of murder or killing, because essentially we're denying someone in some sense, their life, in denying them the fruits and denying them the ability to reap the fruits in proportion to the labor that they invest towards what is rightfully their due. So, brothers, be patient until the coming of the Master. See, the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. The agricultural system, the physical agricultural system, was dependent and very much at the mercy of the natural elements, which is controlled by the benevolent maker of heaven and earth and the sky, who governs the weather and the agricultural seasons, which were dependent on external resources such as the sunlight and the rain from the sky. So it's all in his control, and it demands patience. Now, to be fruitful demands time. Anything in life demands patience. All good things are an investment of time and energy, and we would be spiritually spoiled if spiritual satisfaction was the result of immediate gratification. Very often the principle demands that it be its opposite, and that we persist in pains and hardships and afflictions in order to lay claim of that which is immune to hardship and affliction. You too be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Master has drawn near. This is the all-encompassing incentive of the Christian in every age, the promise that the Messiah will return and enact his righteous rule on the earth for a 1,000-year period, specifically known as the millennium or the seventh dispensation, according to dispensations as traditionally categorized by conventional Christians. And so establishing one's heart means to ready it and prepare it and to purge it of all that is impure, because he whose heart is blinded by the impurities of the earth will not be able to lay claim or lay hold even of the treasures of heaven which await them. Do not grumble against each other, brothers, lest ye be judged. See, the judge is standing at the door. So the inclination of the natural man is to blame his own failures and shortcomings on external actors, i.e., most often, more than not, other people, or society at large. The poor and downtrodden can have the erroneous, simplistic suggestion that society is stacked against them in their favor, and use that as an insurmountable obstacle in order to reap the just rewards of their work and their life, and we are all entitled to certain elements of life on earth, which no man should, in theory, be denied, but is often not the case. But the judge will come, and his justice will be perfect, it will be swift, and it will be total, and that is the incentive we have to wait. And we are, the Christian is commanded, in fact, to, it is, or advised, instructed, that it is spiritually beneficial to bear injury and persecution than to settle the score, or even you can type in Corey Johnston, Matthew 38 through 48, the most difficult commandments, for more on that. My brothers, as an example of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of Yahweh. Now, to be a prophet with the job description entails hardships and persecutions, and that is something we can look to as a positive example when we persist in our trials and our suffering, to know that the fellowship of the suffering belongs to the spiritual saints who survive as our example. And we can go down the list of prophets, but ultimately we don't have enough time. It suffices to say that you'd be hard-pressed to find a prophet who did not know hardship or have to endure suffering and slights and all of the accompanying or entailing hardships that come with the job description. The life of the prophet is a privilege, but it is also a hardship, very much so. See, we call those blessed who endure. You have heard of the endurance of Job, and saw the purpose of Yahweh, that he is very sympathetic and compassionate. Job is the example of perhaps the most perfect example in Scripture of one who was inadvertently struck with unmerited affliction. He lived an upright life and was completely blameless and enjoyed a spotless reputation for honesty and righteousness amongst those of the East. But in one fell sudden day, all of his children and all of his wealth and all of his agricultural abundance were completely obliterated, and he was inflicted with boils. And it belongs to the genre of theodicy, which examines or explains the relationship between suffering and righteousness. But we ultimately don't have enough time to extrapolate on that more fully. But above all, my brothers, do not swear, either by the heavens or by the earth, or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes, and let your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. So he's cautioning against the practice of binding oneself to an oath, because when you bind yourself to an oath to Yahweh, he will hold you to account. So better not to enter any hasty arrangement or agreement which one is not prepared to honor, but far better to speak with integrity and honesty, and to mean what you say, and to say what you mean, and to know what you mean, and to know what you say, lest you fall into judgment. So there is consequences for not honoring your oath. So he's saying that it's better to not enter into one at all than to enter into one you are not prepared to honor. It may seem, in the moment in which you enter it hastily, it may seem that you are prepared to, but more often than not, you don't know what you're signing up for. Is any of you suffering evil? Let him pray. Is anyone in good spirits? Let him sing songs. So this is the balance of fair weather faith and foul weather faith. Very often, a simplistic or immature believer will have one at the expense of the other, but the saints are called to a more all-encompassing balance, and prayer should be not the emergency crutch, but the first instinctive reaction and recourse. Whether in prosperity or affliction, it should be our instinctive reaction and our first and final recourse. Is any among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the assembly, and let them pray over him, having anointed him with oil in the name of the Master. So sickness demands prayer is a spiritual remedy of sorts, which can conceivably translate into physically medicinal qualities. Now, sometimes we feel helpless when a loved one is inflicted with physical pains and ailments, and we wish we could do more, but all we can do is pray. But we owe it to them and ourselves to do what we can, even if all that it be is praying. Now we are to entrust them to medical professionals who can give them the care and the attention and the focus that we cannot, and have the training and expertise, but that should not absolve us of the responsibility to pray. And the prayer of the faith shall save the sick, and the Master shall raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he shall be forgiven. So sin is a spiritual sickness of sorts, which is all physical disease, and death is rooted in the fall of man with our most primitive ancestor, Adam. And the interchange is implicit in this, the idea being that the temporal is spiritual and the spiritual is temporal. Very often we are inclined to artificially segregate them, but Yahweh is master of both the spiritual realm and the physical realm, and we can call on him in the spirit, and he can heal the physical. Confess your trespasses to one another, and pray for one another, so that you are healed. The earnest prayer of a righteous one accomplishes much. Now, the principle of confession is, now, more often than not, most of the sins we commit are technically no one else's business, but if we sin at their expense, then at the very least we owe them a confession or an admission of guilt in order to move forward. And it has a healing process. It contributes collectively or cumulatively to the healing. And the earnest prayer, that is a sincere prayer, well-intentioned and without duplicity, be ye not double-minded, James 1:8 and 4:8. Prayer of a righteous one goes a long way. So even though we're only investing what seems to be insignificant verbal investment, it does in fact go a long way if we are in the right spirit. And Elijah was a man with feelings like us, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. This is the standard Old Testament prophet known as Elijah. We can read of him in the King's account, but we ultimately don't have enough time to extrapolate on all these in as much as we would like to, so we're just going to read the remainder of the chapter in its entirety and maybe leave you with some closing thoughts. And he prayed again, and the heavens gave rain, and the land brought forth its fruit. Brothers, if anyone among you goes astray from the truth, and someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the straying of his way shall save a life from death, and cover a great number of sins. So we are to seek and win the lost, but we are not to lose sight of the saved in our midst, to reduce it to its most simplistic application. And we would like to say more on that, but we're ultimately bereft of time. Thank you so much for tuning in. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.